Okay, so I think that we can start the webinar already. So again, hello, good afternoon, and good evening. I see we've got a global audience today, and welcome everybody to this interactive discussion hosted by Atera and by our guest from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Yes, long name, better known as CISA. My name is Muna Assi. I head product marketing here at Atera, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time to participate in our session today. If you're joining us for the very first time, joining an Atera webinar, I'd like to point you to our website where we have monthly webinars, thought leadership webinars, webinars like these with a lot of our integrated partners and our cybersecurity partners. So please make sure to visit our website at least once a month and stay on top of what we have to offer in terms of webinars. To our loyal customer base, I do want to remind you that we have Oren Elimelech, the Atera CISO. He'll be available live in our newly launched community to answer any questions that you have. He'll be in the community at exactly 8 p.m. That's 1 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. here in Tel Aviv. So right after this webinar, if you haven't yet registered to the Atera community, now is the time. My colleague will point you to the registration link. There you can network with your peers in the industry, with the Atera product and our marketing team. So please, if you haven't yet signed up to our community, now is the time to do it. So our topic for today is about mastering cyber resilience. We're going to talk about best practices for a strong cybersecurity framework. The webinar is aimed at drawing awareness to the threats in the ever-evolving security landscape. Erin will walk us through some practical steps to mature operational resilience and some cybersecurity best practices. And of course, we will be having a broader conversation on how the partnership office within the JCDC at CISA fosters partnership and collaboration within the cybersecurity and infrastructure security space. But before we get into all that, yes, we do have some housekeeping that we want to go through. So this webinar is being recorded. Obviously, all of the attendees are muted, but we do welcome you to please type in all of your questions in the Q&A box, and we will be addressing those towards the end of the webinar. I will be picking and choosing some of the questions, so we may be able to address some a little earlier. So please don't be shy, type in the questions. The recorded webinar will be available both on our website, but also we will be sending it out via email within 48 hours. So please engage with us, send in the questions within the conversation, and we are happy to address. And without further ado, I'm super excited to welcome our special guest today. Erin, welcome.
Thanks, Muna. Great to be here.
So Erin Shepley works as the Chief of the Partnership Office within the JCDC. Erin work carries across government partners, international boundaries, and critical infrastructure sectors to rapidly share relevant cyber threat information and insights and build a better picture of threats to our cyber ecosystem. Erin has worked at DHS for over 12 years, supporting the cybersecurity mission, but always with a focus on partners, and has led development and execution of CISA's Cybersecurity Awareness Month campaign, which I'm sure Erin's going to tell us a lot about in today's session as well. Wonderful. So Erin, let's start with a quick introduction. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your role as the Chief of the Partnership Office within JCDC at CISA, and talk to us about what are, the main objectives within your department.
Absolutely. So first off, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for the invite from Atera. I'm really happy to be here. If you're not familiar with our agency has a diverse mission set, which obviously includes cybersecurity, but also infrastructure security, emergency communications, and other things, but I focus within the cybersecurity division. And as Muna alluded to, we're really focused on the defense and response to cybersecurity incidents. So we're not focused on law enforcement or prosecution or really on the intelligence and attribution of actors, but really understanding the ongoing environment, campaigns, and then really focused at providing guidance and best practices to the community. The team that I sit within the cybersecurity division is relatively new. It was only stood up about 2 years ago. That's when we got our authorities. It's called the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. And it's cool in the sense that, like Muna said, I've worked in partnerships for a long time. This takes partnerships to a little bit of a different angle, and I'll give you guys a few examples that I think are success stories and great to mirror and build on your own side. So within the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, we really focus on 3 things. Again, a lot of it is very public facing. If you've worked with our agency at all, one of the things that you might be familiar with are our products. We put out products in response to the environment, in response to best practices that are being developed, and guidance that we're developing in-house. So on our webpage, and there'll be links at the end of the slide deck that I present a little bit, it will talk about our cybersecurity advisories and different ways that you could subscribe. But the point of the products is a few things. One, any unique and insight information that we get from our own activity or our partners, we put that out into products for the broader consumption and use by the rest of the cyber defense community. But also best practices. I'll talk about some of the services and capabilities that our organization delivers to help whether you're a small organization or a large organization, assess your maturity and build upon the capabilities of your organization relative to cybersecurity. The other 2 principal functions of our office are cyber defensive planning, so identifying risk within the community and developing plans in partnership with private sector to eradicate or mitigate those risks. And I can give a few examples as I talk today. And then last but not least, partnerships. Partnerships kind of function as a operational collaboration type partnership. So in other words, we're constantly exchanging cyber threat information, whether it's incident information, indicators, or TTPs relative to actor activity, but really focusing on building relationships with all of those different partners, whether it's domestic federal agencies here within the United States, critical infrastructure entities, private sector. So think like internet backbone companies, whether they're ISPs or CSPs or large vendors of hardware and software, or cybersecurity companies, state, local governments here domestically within the United States, as well as large international governments, really, again, to share ongoing cyber threat information, but also enrich our understanding of the environment in response to activities.
Thank you, Erin. So really to the point of what you just talked about in terms of the partnership, how does your office facilitate the exchange of information and best practices among these different partners that you spoke about? Because obviously sharing of information is crucial in combating cyber threats. So how do you do that?
Sure. I'm going to break it up into 2 pieces. So the first piece is really working with mature partners who have similar capabilities, but perhaps better tooling, better visibility, that will further enrich our understanding of the environment. So let me give a quick example. Going into the invasion and war in Ukraine, we were assessing, risk and any sort of retaliatory activity that we might see domestically here in the United States should we impose sanctions on Russia. So, for instance, if the sanctions were financial in nature, would there be retaliation against the financial sector? Obviously, perhaps maybe not obviously, the U.S. government does have visibility of financial sector networks. So obviously, we'd have to work with that sector to understand what was happening. So we built a relationship with the computer emergency readiness team within Ukraine, the CERT within Ukraine, who was sharing IPs associated with denial of service attacks that they were seeing from Russia in the very early days of the invasion. We were then able to share that with the financial sector to say, not only are we seeing this in various DDoS attacks within Ukraine, are you seeing these IPs being used in attempted or any denial of service attacks here domestically? So that was one way of like building information, building a relationship, kind of giving unique information that we had based off our relationships with international partners, but also beginning and assessing the domestic impacts of that activity. On the flip side, when we receive information, IPs is kind of a weird one where, obviously that infrastructure is burned and turned over pretty quickly. But if there's indicators of compromise or tactics, techniques, and procedures that we glean from various incidents or from partners, one of the principal interests of CISA is to make sure that information is shared as quickly and as rapidly as possible so that it is actionable by cyber defenders. So that happens through various ways. One is through products, but the other is through various mechanisms that we engage. So say it's a campaign or activity that we think is focused within a particular sector, we'll engage that sector and share those indicators in sometimes more sensitive ways rather than public products, so that the adversary doesn't realize or doesn't know that we're observing those TTPs.
So to that specifically, Erin, I think there's a question here that says, and as part of this engagement, do you have any privacy concerns with sharing some of that information as you work also global?
Yeah, so that's interesting. Obviously, in the United States, there are a lot of laws governing the type of information that we share and what would be identifiable as like personally identifiable information. We have pretty strict guidance over, and our legal counsel will give us guidance over what we do share. But largely, we're really focused at cyber defensive information. We're not sharing, computer specific details. And I'm not a lawyer, so I probably am not the best person to answer this question. But there are not only laws governing that, but also legal counsel within our organization that helps assess should we not be sure whether the information that we're sharing could tie back to a person's identity.
Wonderful. And back to those partnerships. So you talked about possibly sharing some of those successful partnerships or initiatives that you've done or that you've established to improve cyber defense capabilities. Do you want to elaborate on such successful partnership?
Sure. An example I love to give, and I apologize that it's dated, but I think it was a really successful example, is folks might remember, and it was quite unique, the Log4j or Log4Shell vulnerability, which happened as a 0-day. I think it was on a Friday evening leading into the weekend. And as we started to assess the risk environment, we were extremely dependent on vendors of software and hardware to understand how they were vulnerable. And not only whether they were vulnerable, what the steps to mitigation would be. So our response to that was super collaborative in the sense that we built a GitHub site where we were able to post a list and work with hundreds of vendors to assess, were they vulnerable to the Log4j vulnerability, what versions, and what the mitigation recommendations would be, so that there was one single place any user from any community, whether it's private sector or federal government, whatever, could go and assess, okay, am I using any of these products? How would I mitigate? And so that was updated by us, but in conjunction with vendors, honestly, on a daily basis as that situation evolved. On the flip side, we were also interested in exploitation and understanding what tactics were being used to exploit and actors that were exploiting this vulnerability. So we were working with the cybersecurity threat companies, internet service providers, cloud service providers to assess the threat environment and provide, best practices and guidance on whether it was detection or mitigation measures based off of threat activity. So I think that was a truly uniquely collaborative way that we were able to try to assess, which was a very problematic and broad-reaching vulnerability, and impacting multiple vendors, right, which we wouldn't necessarily have oversight of. And if you were a user, you'd have to go to 5 different sites to see if various tooling you had was vulnerable and try to condense it for ease of consumption and rapid mitigation by the end user.
So I do want to remind our audience, you are welcome to type in questions in the Q&A box, and Erin and I are more than happy to address. So specific to that, within the example, obviously your team also needs to adapt to the constantly evolving landscape. So you talked about certain partnerships also with the security vendors. Do you collaborate with any research organizations or specific industry experts to stay ahead of these or address some of these issues?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a two-pronged approach. One of it is through partnership, and one of it is through a hiring model that we've adapted here within the team. So through partnerships, there are many facets of IT and OT security. We can't be experts in all of them. So there very much is this collaborative approach to everything we do. Oftentimes we share or pre-release our products, not only with the vendor of the impacted activity, but other experts in the field that understand perhaps this device, operational technology, or the sector far better than us, to add to the guidance or corroborate the guidance. Similar on our planning efforts. So if we're developing a plan in response to a particular, critical infrastructure sector, we're going to be working very closely with that sector to understand and shape that plan. So again, it's kind of one of the things that I've seen evolve out of the way that our agency works, where it's not purely government guidance, it's truly collaborative. And you'll see that oftentimes in our products, where there's multi-seals, not only multiple government agencies that contributed to it, but we'll have anecdotally within the document who else contributed from a private sector standpoint. On the flip side, internally, from like a manager managing a team, we've begun to hire different folks from different sectors so that they better understand that sector's concerns or where they're coming from or gaps. So focused on things like energy and OT expertise, financial expertise, industrial control systems. So hiring folks into our team so that we have multiple mindsets. And that was just critical infrastructure. I've also hired people from different federal agencies that have been within their chief information or chief information security office and responsible for the management of that agency's networks. So again, trying to have a well-rounded cadre of cybersecurity defenders and network managers so that when we provide guidance or we assess what our response is to the environment, it's one that is taking all of these different sectors and perspectives into mind.
Perfect. So I know that we're here to talk about operational resilience and maturity, and I know you're excited to share some of the content that you've put together. There is a question here from Joe. Can you advise on how your agency work internationally with MSSPs? He says, we have a significant cyber threat intelligence function in Ireland, which is the first of its kind, and they can only do this with the partnership they hold with the FBI and Europol for their national critical infrastructure clients. So is there any specific work that your agency is doing with MSSPs globally?
I'm trying to find that question because it was a long one.
We can hold that and allow you to read it later.
Yeah, I was reading a different question in the chat and I'm having trouble finding that one.
So it's right at the top, but we can come back to it. It's really about how does your agency work, and if you do, internationally with MSSPs.
So we focus our work with domestically owned. Of course, we have partnerships with foreign-owned companies, but when it is a foreign-owned company, our relationship usually starts with the country where that company resides. So for instance, if it was a company based in Ireland, we'd work with the government of Ireland before we would work with that company. I saw some folks from Canada. We work with BlackBerry a lot. We have a relationship with their US counterparts, but often we work with the government of Canada and engaging with BlackBerry. So our usual course of action is to work with the government that, where that company resides, unless it's a truly multinational company, in which case we often have relationships and their subsidiaries within the United States.
Great. I hope that answers your question, Joe. Erin, within our own customer base, we do recognize that a lot of small and medium-sized businesses and even small public sector entities, they face unique challenges when they need to address cybersecurity risks. A lot of them seem to be resource constrained. They've got limited budgets. They may have a limited IT staffing. And we know that when it comes to bad actors, right, they don't discriminate and they look to exploit some of these perceived vulnerabilities. What do you see today as the biggest obstacles to raising cybersecurity posture for a lot of these businesses?
There's a huge cost imposed, and I think an overwhelming sense of where do I start? But also the environment is relentless. Obviously, we've seen crime go away from your traditional physical crime to cybercrime, and ransomware is rampant and everywhere and ravaging each continent equally. There are two things I'd like to say. I think the first piece is around an initiative that we're calling Secure by Design. But then the other piece is I can start to kind of go into the presentation and some of the resources that we have. But our leadership, our director, Jen Easterly, has begun a campaign that we call Secure by Design and Secure by Default. And really the principle of this is taking away the onus from the purchasers of hardware and software who may be poorly resourced and not have a lot of either cybersecurity or IT management in-house expertise, and taking away the onus of them to keep up with various patch management life cycles and updates and mitigation actions they need to apply, and putting the onus back on the companies that deliver these services, that they should be, one, secure by design and secure by default. And if any of you are network managers or have deployed things, you probably have seen things where, a lot of the security features are off by default and they have to be enabled, and various functions that maybe your average user wouldn't have implemented when first purchasing the tool or the capability. So the whole idea of this campaign is, again, to work with these large companies and say, you're providing services to millions, if not billions of customers. If you take greater steps in the security of the software that you're building in the first place and how you distribute it, then maybe there would be a lot less incidents because we won't have these lagging patch life cycles that we see that are often exploited by actors. The second half of it is there are obviously a lot of resources that not only does the US government provide, but governments internationally around maturity capabilities, best practices, and information sharing. And that's kind of the core three pieces that I have in my presentation. But I'll pause there, Muna, and see if there's any other questions you want me to address before I go into that.
So there is one question back to the partnerships and how do you approve or facilitate a CISA approved partner?
I did see that question, and we get that question a lot, especially domestically. People want us to validate a vendor or tell them who they should work with. We don't do that for various legal reasons. But what I do oftentimes point people towards is there is a very public purchasing schedule that we use in the federal government. And there is a criteria that our Government Services Administration, or GSA, uses to accredit, and they have standards that they put in place, the various vendors that we work with or software that we acquire. So while there isn't a vetting process that we push out, there are these GSA purchase vehicles where you could see, based off federal government thresholds and risk assessments, these are the vendors that we work with as a US government. As for me and my partnerships role, we're very interested in working with a lot of partners, particularly partners that have, again, that visibility, that tooling, the maturity of capabilities. We want to have a bidirectional relationship. There are parts of the organization that are very focused on service delivery and capacity building. My office isn't particularly one of them. What we're really looking is building relationships with folks that can continue to enrich our understanding of the environment. Also, on the flip side, if there are vendors and there's a large use of that product domestically, we're also going to want to work with that vendor for various reasons, whether it's vulnerability disclosure practices, but also understanding and working with them longer term on the services and tooling that they provide domestically.
So Erin, you'll share within your deck how they can reach out or how they can create that connection within your office?
The GSA purchasing schedule, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I can provide that link. The other one is we have a large procurement program where we've built a continuous diagnostic and mitigation program for the federal government. And that's a large acquisition program. And that purchasing schedule is also public. So you can see the services and capabilities. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that we are standing up a broader cybersecurity service offering capability. So again, within that same purchasing schedule. So if you're domestically based here in the United States, you may be familiar with this already. But as we develop requirements or needs from new tools and capabilities, and we work to acquire those through private sector, that will also be publicly posted and shared. So I can share both of those links, Muna.
Perfect. And we'll add those to the emails that we send out as well. Let's really now go down into operational resilience. We understand that it's crucial in today's landscape, but it'd be great if we can zoom out and really get an overview of what is operational resilience. What does it really mean in the context of cybersecurity? And why is it important for organizations to prioritize it?
Absolutely. So I'm going to open my deck here, and this is by no means everything, but I tried to pull together a snapshot of the most easily to consume, highest impact products and tooling that we've released as an organization. I've bucketed them into really three categories. This first one is focused on benchmarks and maturity. The second one is on best practices, and the last one's on information sharing. I've talked a little bit about each of these, but I wanted to give some specific examples. And there's screenshots and there's links to all of these things. Again, all of this is very publicly available. The first are a new released template framework, if you will, that we're calling the Cybersecurity Performance Goals. I will flag that it is IT infrastructure based. We are going to be coming out with an OT infrastructure based model. I like to flag it because if you can tell from my tiny screenshot, it is supremely easy to use. It is a PDF. It is a fill it out and self-assess capability, and it is a lot more truncated than if you were to work through the full unabridged version of what I have listed here, the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's broken into the same methodology: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. But it's a nice checklist of what our organization has assessed to be the most critical functions within each of those categories. So that's, again, a downloadable PDF. Organizations can take it and do a level of self-assessment. I've also listed a second self-assessment called our Cyber Resilience Review. This is a maturity modeling assessment that, again, is a downloadable self-assessment function that is kind of capable for, I would say, anyone from a small to medium-sized organization. It wouldn't be what I would recommend for a mature organization. You're going to probably be more advanced than what this review provides. But again, it's a self-assessment that you can use to, again, self-assess, identify critical areas for growth, and benchmark where you need to go for years to come, whether it's from a staffing, funding, purchasing standpoint. And obviously, each organization is dependent. So there's going to be a level of risk that you apply to each of these things. And there might be areas that are more risk depending on the services you provide or your mission or your function, and others that you can deprioritize. So, for someone, the public exposure of information or things like that might be at higher risk than different organizations that are perhaps delivering services and don't have a outward, internet-facing presence. Last but not least, a lot of these if not all of them, are really focused and based off the NIST cybersecurity framework, which was released numerous years ago and kind of has been adopted largely as a global standard. There are various other maturity models and guidance that have been developed, but this one is quite robust and definitely worth taking a look at. This is a snapshot, a very small snapshot of some of the tools and frameworks, but I did want to highlight again the cyber performance goals because this is one of the newer released products from our organization, and again, incredibly easy to use, downloadable PDF that can be done once, built upon, and again used as a benchmark for years to come. The second slide here is cybersecurity best practices. Again, I only have 2 listed here. On our website, we have a lot of documents aimed at small, medium-sized businesses around establishing the role of leadership, the role of the CIO and CISO, the role of the security team. I pulled an excerpt of the role of leadership guidance here, but really this is, if you're in a small organization or a medium-sized organization and you don't have a sizable cybersecurity, information security office. This is, kind of building that culture, empowering different levels of leadership and what their roles and responsibilities should be within that program, and how to enable them. So here, we have the example of what is the role of leadership. It's largely around the development and support of a culture of cybersecurity within the organization, supporting a security program manager, could be that, could be a CIO, could be a CISO, could be a CTO, reviewing and approving an incident response plan, which is going to be very unique based off your organization's purpose and function and the service it provides. We've seen great success in involving leadership in tabletop exercises so that they understand the impact of cybersecurity incidents on the organization and its mission and its public image and things like that, and supporting IT leadership. And again, that's very basic and foundational for the building, but we have these listed for various levels of leadership within the office. The other best practice I want to mention, because I think when we started this, it wasn't the intent, but it's become somewhat of a widely adopted, at least nationally, if not international standard, is we found ourselves responding to vulnerabilities within the federal government, zero-day vulnerabilities, or vulnerabilities that began to be exploited. And each time that happened, it was a race to respond and react. So what we did within the federal government is standardize patch management on vulnerabilities based off of their CVSS, but also based off of whether they're publicly or CISA known exploited. So we started this known exploited database. I have a snapshot of what it looks like here. You can see it lists a CVE, the type of product, what the vulnerability is, when it was added, the description, and what the recommendation or mitigation is. And again, like I said, this was started because every single time we saw a 0-day or we saw a vulnerability that began to be exploited by, say, a different APT actor, there was a level of guidance and mitigation. So now we've standardized those response timelines, and basically, in addition to this public catalog, triggers that federal agency reaction. And the reason I bring it up here is because we've seen critical infrastructure adopt this methodology and follow this known exploited database. And I bring it up here also because it's a great way to prioritize. And from a patch management and asset management standpoint, a lot of people don't know where to start. Obviously, having a strong asset inventory is critical, but also if you don't have your own vulnerability scoring methodology, you can use this as a prioritization schema, or one prioritization schema, to assess the timeline and rate at which you need to patch. Accompanying that, highly recommended, we provide this, and there's a lot of services out there, is just basic open IP scanning. And I know a lot of other governments provide this, a lot of private sector provides this, but basically we have continued to evolve we call it cyber hygiene, but our vulnerability scanning capabilities. Now they have flags, so you would get a report if you're subscribed to the service. and it says, basically, we see these 4 vulnerabilities that you have not patched. And by the way, this one and this one is part of the known exploited vulnerability database. In other words, we know a criminal actor or an adversary is actively exploiting this vulnerability, so patch it sooner than later. And again, we've seen amazing uptick in patch management in response to those 2 things. Last but not least, I mentioned this earlier, but information sharing is critical. It's become a cliche term, unfortunately, but I wanted to talk about a few different ways, and I've already highlighted some of them of how we've enabled this. I got asked this question earlier, is like, what do you think we're most at risk to, and what's the worst thing going on out there? And everything's bad, but ransomware is particularly ravaging currently. And we stood up a campaign last year called StopRansomware.gov. It's a single government standpoint point for people to access resources. I have a very small screenshot of the webpage. Obviously, there's resources, alerts, ways to report. But this is our consolidated way of all of our reporting on various ransomware actors, which is updated regularly. And it's not just based off incidents and TTPs and like cyber defense information. We also have best practices. So there's a full guide on there on how to respond to ransomware and all of the different things that you can do to prepare and prevent ransomware from happening. But should ransomware happen, the actions your organization can take in response to them. I mentioned cybersecurity alerts and advisories. There's an easy subscription service. I would recommend you subscribe to as many as possible. Ideally, maybe you have a filtering capability, or there's an automated ingest function, even better, that you can put it into your tooling. But the more insights and information you can get from partners, the better. And an easy way to do that is subscribing to alerts and advisories. A lot of ours are public and public facing. We have an automated email delivery function. So you simply sign up with your email, and then as soon as that alert is available and pushed to the website, you would get it directly in your mailbox. The last point I did want to kind of harp on is what I've seen, particularly if I could say innovative and successful in the standing up of the JCDC, was building an information sharing network. We had relationships before, we had partnerships before, but I think the way that we utilized them was different. A lot of it was us providing guidance and resources, which we still do. But now those relationships have turned to bidirectional and utilizing that network to better do our jobs as CISA and as an agency. So I listed a few different, we've built sectoral relationships. So where we work with just the energy sector, the finance sector, the water sector, and we understand what their risks are, but also work with them in response to incidents and activities directly. Trusted is important. We've built trusted relationships. I mean, part of it is face-to-face. Part of it is offering as much as you're accepting, right? So the relationship isn't going to be super successful if you're only asking for information and giving nothing back. So a huge part of my daily thought process is what value can I provide to partners so that when I come knocking and asking questions, they want to provide value in return. So what unique insights and data do I have that I can share to enrich their capabilities, their ability to respond to activity, and small. So we've learned that, no one wants to share sensitive information with a group of 200 people, right? Usually when an incident is happening, you're still in discovery phase. Some of the indicators you may share might yield false positives. You might have incorrect assumptions that are later rectified. And there's often trepidation in sharing that information early because it hasn't been quite validated and vetted yet. However, if the group is small and trusted and somewhat transparent, we've seen that information can be shared early, even with those caveats, and often yielding better results before the adversary, again, changes tactics, moves networks, or things like that. I think we're going to go into some questions and answers. I'll just pop this up on the screen. Before we do that, I have a list of all of these things are on these public-facing websites. Hopefully you find them somewhat easy to navigate. but I'll provide some additional links in the follow-up email that comes out a little bit later this week on some of these other services that I've mentioned. But Muna, I'm going to turn it back to you for any other additional questions.
Fantastic, Erin. So I'm looking through here. Again, I do encourage the audience. I know that this has been a wealth of information, and we will be sharing the direct links also via email. So don't worry if you can't access them here. So please go ahead, pop in your questions in the Q&A. I know, Erin, you did touch briefly on incident response. Maybe this is not something that is specific within your department, but do you have any recommendations or best practices for developing and implementing an effective incident response plan, or want to point us to?
Yes. Yeah, so we have all of our services, and a lot of the things that I referenced, like that cyber resilience review, are within a service catalog. And the nice thing about the service catalog is it's somewhat tailored for the user. So it's almost like you're shopping, right? So you have all of these options on the left-hand side, and you're like, I want this size and this color and this type of shirt, and then it will filter. The service catalog operates in a similar function that you can say, I want foundational assessments that are cybersecurity maturity based, and we'll filter out those. Because as I was perusing the catalog in preparation for this, it could be daunting. There are many, many pages of services, and it's much better if you start to filter based off of your organizational maturity model and exactly what you're looking for. But to answer your actual question, Muna, yes, there are several guidance and templates and recommendations on building and exercising and testing incident response capabilities and incident response plans on the service catalog.
Wonderful. I do have a very broad, generic question, but I think that it's clearly obvious in today's landscape where innovation, is critical. There's a question that says, do you see security and compliance as a roadblock to innovation? Or is it really an integral part of transformation? Pretty broad, but from your perspective, how do you relate to how your team is innovating and staying ahead of the threats and, again, being compliant?
I think it's an interesting question. I might have a somewhat pessimistic view that with a lot of the tooling, software and hardware that is developed, what is the goal or desired end state of the company? Is it to make money or provide secure tooling and capabilities to its users? Arguably, it's a little bit of both, but do you want it fast and cheap, or do you want it? So I think that we constantly see this trade-off in at least the American marketplace, not just for technology, but for everything. And that's where I do see that a level of legislation and compliance does come into play when perhaps we're putting the price and speed before the security. And that kind of goes back to that secure by design methodology or mentality. On an internal standpoint, obviously it is impossible to stay ahead of things. This is a daunting space. There's always something new. There's always going to be some vulnerability in some software that I've literally never heard of before in my life. And I can't be expected to know all things. And that's why we have such a diverse group of employees here, not only sectorally, but also from their expertise in either application or product development, software management. And so we're really, as an organization, relying on multiple parts of the team. And what is this vulnerability and what does it look like within the software? How would an adversary exploit it and what would they have access to? And then how do we engage our partners and tell them those best practices? Those are three different areas of expertise that we constantly bring to the table to try to assess whatever's happening within the environment.
So a final question here that I'm going to take. What is the largest item you're seeing related to OT cybersecurity, or the biggest threat?
That's an interesting question. I'm not a specialist in OT cybersecurity. However, I think it's an area that needs a lot of continued growth and investment. Obviously, a lot of money and time has been placed in the IT side of things and less on the OT side of things. We have built assessments, we have built capabilities to kind of assess OT cybersecurity. But I think, at least if I could speak for myself and our team, there's still a huge way to go to better understand that landscape and understand the needs of that community. And also, I think just like a training and education piece, there's a lot of investment here domestically around training owners and operators to understand what cybersecurity incidents can look like within that environment, and then best practices and how to structure the IT and business side and the OT side of things. And I realize that's probably not the best answer, but again, I'm going to caveat it with I'm not an OT expert, but these are some of the things that CISA is looking to continue to invest in. And like I mentioned before, that cybersecurity performance goals focused on IT, going to be developing an OT version, which is going to have a different look and feel and applicability.
So very, very briefly before we close today's very exciting session with Erin, are there any upcoming initiatives or projects that you're super excited about within your team?
The Secure by Design continues to evolve. I think that's going to be our next biggest campaign that we hope as a global movement. The other piece that I hope everyone participates in on an annual basis, it's been ongoing for something like 15 years now, is the annual Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And this is a basic cybersecurity awareness initiative that is evergreen. We update it with, kind of the most recent risks, and it's very consumer and user based. So we're talking about, personal scams, talking about phishing, talking about Wi-Fi security, social media security, cybersecurity bullying. So if you haven't participated in that program previously, I highly encourage it. Just as a person, like, you can go and talk to your kids' school about cybersecurity and being safe online. You can go talk to your community. And that's one where there's a bunch of resources. We as a government participate. Basically, 20 to 50 other international governments participate annually. It's usually held in October and is a great opportunity for all of you as kind of experts or those with a vested interest in this field to kind of like give back, if you will, and make sure other people understand how to be safe and secure online.
Fantastic. Erin, this has been really exciting for me, and I'm sure for our attendees today. I want to really thank you for your time. For the experience. I want to remind the audience we will be sharing both the recording and the links within the next 48 hours. I also want to remind you, I did see some questions here around Atera and security. Please, there is a link to our community. Join the community. Our CISA will be live in about 15 minutes for an hour to answer any of your questions around security or anything else. Erin, thank you so much. We love the partnership. Thank you for taking the time. Everybody, thank you and have a great rest of week.
Thanks, Muna. Thanks, everybody.